Welcome, curious minds. Tonight we travel back to the cobblestone streets of 18th century Dublin, where the air smelled of smoke, sweat, and something oddly sweet, brewing malt. You might think you know Guinness, the dark, creamy beer that's been poured into millions of glasses around the world. But what if I told you, each pint might carry the weight of a centuries-old curse? Yes, Arthur Guinness didn't just build an empire. He might have built a trap. Picture this. The year is 1759. The brewery is silent, except for the echo of dripping water and the faint hiss of fermenting vats. Arthur stands alone under flickering candlelight, signing a contract that will outlive him by almost 9,000 years. 9,000 years. That's not a business deal, that's an eternity. But here's the part they don't tell you in the cheerful brewery tours. The lease he signed was so bizarrely long, so absurdly specific, that even historians whispered, who in their right mind writes a deal that binds their bloodline until the year 10,759? Some say Arthur was a genius. Others say he wasn't alone that night. There's an old Dublin legend, rarely spoken in public houses, that a stranger visited the Guinness brewery on the eve of that signing. No one remembers his name. Some say his eyes reflected the firelight too brightly, and when Arthur poured him a drink, the foam settled into the shape of a cross, upside down. By sunrise, the ink had dried, and the stranger was gone. The first batch of Guinness brewed the next morning came out darker than ever before, and no one could explain why, but the beer flowed, and so did the gold. Within decades, the Guinness name became Ireland's beating heart. Money, fame, and a family that seemed untouchable. Until they weren't. Because every empire built on luck eventually has to pay the tab. Before we start, don't forget to like this video and subscribe, only if you enjoy unlocking the mysteries of history with me. Now, what do you think? Was Arthur Guinness just a visionary businessman, or the man who accidentally sold his soul for a perfect pint? Sit back, relax, and let's unlock history together. The year was 1759. You're standing in the chill of a Dublin morning, your breath forming pale ghosts in the air. Around you, the city groans awake, horse hooves on cobblestone, the smell of yeast and smoke. In front of you stands a man, Arthur Guinness, pen poised above a piece of parchment, longer than a priest's sermon and heavier than a king's debt. 9,000 years, he mutters, eyes glinting. The ink gleams like oil under candlelight. You swear it moves, like it's alive. Welcome to St. James's Gate, where one of the strangest contracts in human history was signed. The document promised Arthur Guinness ownership of the land for 9 millennia, at a rent so laughably small it could barely buy you a pint today. But what everyone remembers as genius business foresight might have been something darker. Because according to a few too many ignored tavern whispers, Arthur wasn't negotiating with a landlord that morning. He was negotiating with something else. Locals said they saw him arguing alone in that empty brewery long after the ink had dried, his lips moving, eyes wild, like he was debating terms with an invisible guest. The next day, the brewery gates opened. The vats began to boil, and Dublin filled with a scent no one had ever smelled before. Bittersweet, smoky, almost metallic. And from that moment on, things started to change. Arthur's fortunes rose faster than the foam on a fresh pour. Within years, he went from a nobody brewer to a name spoken with reverence and fear. Guinness wasn't just a drink anymore, it was an invocation. People toasted with it at births, funerals, and coronations, and the Guinness family never seemed to fall from favor. But those who worked closest to Arthur began to vanish. Workers who helped in the original batch were said to go blind or mad. One was found drowned in a barrel, his lungs filled not with beer, but with something thicker, darker. And yet Arthur never aged quite like the others. Portraits painted years apart showed the same spark in his eyes, the same youth in his face, as if time itself had been part of the deal. You wonder, was it genius? Was it madness? Or was it the price of something no man should ever sign for? Because as the legend goes, that lease wasn't just for land, it was for immortality. You can almost hear it, the slow drip of something thick falling into an oak barrel. The smell is heavy, sweet, and strange, like roasted barley mixed with iron. You blink, and Arthur Guinness is there again, standing by the vat, staring into the bubbling black liquid that will one day become his empire. Only tonight, there's someone else in the room. No one knows who or what that figure was. The workers who spoke of it were either drunk or dead by morning. Some said it was just a shadow. Others swore they saw horns curl out from under the candlelight. Perfection, Arthur whispered, but perfection always demands a price. The deal, if it happened, was simple enough. Prosperity for 9,000 years, in exchange for something no brewer could bottle, his bloodline. And here's where it gets darker. In 1761, 2 years after signing the lease, Arthur's firstborn son nearly drowned in a barrel at the brewery. He survived, but his hair turned white overnight. Another child died of fever before age 10. Locals started avoiding the St. James's Gate brewery after sunset, claiming they heard chanting echoing from within the walls, low, rhythmic, like monks praying backward. But the beer? Oh, it was divine, velvety, smooth, addictive. People described it like it had a soul. Arthur brewed not like a man, but like an alchemist, adding ingredients no one else dared use, whispering to the fermenting vats as though speaking to something listening back. The foam on his test batches formed strange sigils, repeating shapes that no one could explain. And perhaps the strangest coincidence of all, on the day Guinness first exported beer to England, lightning struck St. Patrick's Cathedral just a mile away. The priest who witnessed it called it a sign. But whether from heaven or hell, no one could agree. Years later, Arthur was seen walking alone near the Liffey River. A witness said he dipped his hand into the black water, murmured, "It's almost ready." When asked what he meant, Arthur only smiled and said, "The devil drinks too, you know." Was it metaphor? Madness? Or just a drunk man talking to his reflection? You can almost taste the answer. Bitter, rich, and dark as sin. You can smell it before you even see it. Roasted barley, sweet malt, and something darker lurking beneath. It's the 1790s, and Guinness has become more than a drink. It's a religion. Taverns hum with laughter, barrels roll through cobblestone streets, and somewhere in Dublin, the Guinness name starts to mean something close to divine right. But here's the thing about empires. They're never built on bubbles and foam. Each barrel shipped across Europe seemed to take something with it. In 1795, a cargo bound for France capsized off the Irish coast. The sea was calm until the barrels hit the water. Survivors claimed the ocean turned black, bubbling like tar, and the sailors swore they heard singing from below. No one ever found the bodies. A year later, one of Arthur's nephews fell ill, coughing up blood so dark it stained the sheets like ink. The doctor's report called it melancholic humors. Locals called it the stout's curse. Still, the beer flowed. By 1800, Guinness had spread through England, Portugal, even reaching the Caribbean. Every new shipment brought fortune and another tragedy. A warehouse foreman in Bristol dropped dead after tasting the first pint from a fresh cask. In Madrid, an importer's wife vanished the night she opened a shipment labeled Batch 66. And through it all, Arthur's descendants kept brewing. They expanded the factory, dug deeper cellars, added new vats that could hold thousands of gallons. And yet, every record shows the same thing. Whenever production increased, someone in the family died within the month. You stand now in your mind, inside the St. James's Gate Brewery. The walls sweat with condensation, and the air hums. The barrels line up like soldiers. You touch one. The wood is warm, alive. Some say the Guinness family never controlled the beer controlled them. That it demanded expansion, demanded blood, a kind of black gold that grew richer with every death. the empire was unstoppable. The curse, undeniable, because no matter where the stout went, death followed, like a loyal customer who never forgot to pay his tab. It's the winter of 1803 and Dublin is choking in fog, the kind that feels alive, crawling across the cobblestones like spilled ink. Inside St. James's Gate Brewery, the air smells of hops, smoke, and grief. Another Guinness heir, only 24, has died suddenly. They say it was pneumonia, but the whispers in the taverns call it something else. You stand among the mourners, the clinking of glasses echoing off stone walls. Every man in the room raises a pint of the black stout, its creamy head catching the candlelight like a halo. They drink in silence, not in celebration, but in surrender. Because every funeral in this family ends the same way, with a toast that feels more like a pact. And then someone, no one remembers who, suggests they bury him beneath the brewery itself. A son of Guinness should rest with his creation, an old worker mutters. By dawn, the casket is lowered into a cellar chamber that hadn't been opened in decades. When the workers lift their torches, the light flickers across the walls, and there it is. A symbol, carved deep into the stone. Not a cross, not a family crest. Something older, a circle within a triangle, intersected by a chalice. Beneath it, a line of Latin, in spiritu fortitudine, sanguis servit, in strength of spirit, the blood serves. The priests call it blasphemy. The foreman calls it branding. But one brewer, an old man with trembling hands, swears he's seen it before, on the inside of Arthur Guinness's original brewing book. That night, strange things begin to happen. The fermentation room grows cold, though the fires burn bright. A shipment of beer curdles overnight, thickening like blood. And in the dead hours before dawn, one worker claims he saw condensation forming words on a keg's surface. He is not gone. When word reaches the surviving Guinness brothers, they respond in the only way they know, by brewing more. Twice the volume, twice the strength. As if drowning grief in barley could wash away whatever stirs beneath those stone floors. But the next morning, the foreman who discovered the symbol is found slumped over a barrel. Eyes open, skin pale, mouth stained dark. Not with beer, but something thicker. And yet, production doesn't stop, because in the Guinness family, even death has a deadline. You take another sip of the story. It's bitter, heavy, and leaves a strange aftertaste. Some say that first burial beneath the brewery sealed more than a coffin. It sealed the deal. The year is 1833. Dublin smells of rain, iron, and ambition. The Guinness Empire has outgrown its island. Barrels roll out of the city like black coffins on wheels, bound for London, Paris, and the New World. You can almost hear the thunder of the horses, the laughter of dock workers, and the faint hiss of ale seeping from barrels that have traveled too far. To the world, Guinness is prosperity. To the family, it's inheritance, not just of wealth, but of weight. Arthur's sons and grandsons build mansions, buy land, and walk with politicians. The brand becomes a crown jewel of British trade. Yet, behind the velvet curtains of those grand estates, portraits begin to disappear from the walls. Literally. At least, that's what the servants whisper. They say the painted eyes of the ancestors fade first, until only the mouths remain, smiling faintly, as if amused by the living. By mid-century, Guinness beer is everywhere. In pubs from Boston to Bombay, in ships crossing oceans, in royal banquets. The taste of civilization, a newspaper calls it. But success has a strange aftertaste, because every new factory seems to replace something, a life, a memory, a person. When Edward Guinness, Arthur's great-grandson, opens the London branch in 1886, he insists on installing a chapel inside the brewery to keep the blessings flowing, he jokes. But when the priest blesses the vats with holy water, one of them erupts, spewing black foam that smells faintly of copper and salt. The workers cross themselves. Edward laughs it off. But that night, he dreams of the River Liffey, the same river where Arthur once brewed his first batch, running thick and dark, not with ale, but blood. In the morning, he finds his pillow soaked through, not red but brown, like stout. He never speaks of it again. As Guinness conquers the world, the family becomes haunted by something subtler than ghosts: silence. Heirs stop appearing in portraits. Letters go unanswered. One son joins the Navy and vanishes at sea. Another dies in his sleep before his 30th birthday. And yet the brewery thrives. The logo sharpens. The harp shines brighter. It's as if the empire demands a balance. Every barrel filled requires something emptied. You can almost imagine Arthur's voice echoing through time. Every pour takes a price. My son, don't let it run dry. And so, from Dublin to the farthest corners of the world, people raise their pints, unaware that with every toast, a name in the Guinness family quietly fades into history. You can almost smell the perfume of powdered wigs and scandal. By the mid-1800s, the Guinness name has become more than beer. It's a ticket to the upper crust of British society. Marquises, duchesses, and barons all clink glasses of dark stout, pretending it's champagne. And why not? The Guinness fortune could buy half of Ireland, and probably the better half. You're in London now, at a dinner where silver spoons gleam and secrets ripple beneath polite laughter. Edward Guinness, later to become Lord Iva, toasts the Queen. His wife, Lady Adelaide, smiles with the poise of someone who has learned how to hide both boredom and dread. Because in this family, every wedding seems to come with an aftertaste. 3 marriages, 3 funerals. One bride falls from a horse. One heir dies of sleeping sickness, though the doctors can't agree on what he caught or where. And one wedding portrait mysteriously fades within a year, with the bride's image disappearing first. Rumor spreads through London drawing rooms. The Irish brewer's blood doesn't mix well with blue. Some laugh, some cross themselves. One newspaper whispers about a curse of the black chalice. Another hints that the Guinness family carries an old pact, inked not in law, but in something thicker. It doesn't help that the Guinness heirs begin behaving oddly. One refuses to drink anything but water, from a silver chalice engraved with Arthur's initials. Another keeps a locked room filled with barrels that he calls the family's lungs. At night, servants hear whispers from inside, like the bubbling of fermenting ale, but slower. Politically, though, the Guinnesses thrive. They donate to hospitals, fund libraries, and even sit in Parliament. On the surface, they're saints of philanthropy, the model of nobility. But privately, diaries tell another story. Lady Adelaide's 1879 entry reads, "The men of this family never age the same way. Some bloom, some rot. The ale keeps flowing, and so must the blood." You can't help but wonder, maybe the Guinnesses didn't marry into nobility for power or prestige. Maybe they needed new blood. And perhaps the reason for all those lavish toasts wasn't celebration, but ritual. Each clink of crystal glasses marking not just union, but renewal. In the end, every dynasty has its poison. The Guinnesses, theirs just happens to come with a creamy head and a 9,000-year shelf life. You're standing in the middle of St. James's Gate Brewery, the air thick with the smell of roasted barley and secrets. The year is 1929. The Guinness family is throwing one of its lavish midnight parties. Champagne, jazz, and enough velvet suits to make Gatsby look underdressed. But tonight, something feels off. The heir, Walter Edward Guinness, handsome, witty, and just a little too pale, is missing from the ballroom. When you finally find him, he's not flirting with the debutantes or inspecting the beer vats. He's standing at the top of the brewery tower, staring at the moonlight spilling through the stained glass window. "Do you hear it?" he whispers. He's speaking again. Arthur's voice. That's what Walter claims to hear every full moon, the founder himself, murmuring from the walls of the brewery. At first, the family laughs it off. Too much stout, they say. But then Walter begins repeating things he couldn't possibly know. Numbers from Arthur's original 1759 lease, the location of the first hidden vault, even the exact date Arthur's heart stopped beating. And then come the sketches. Walter starts filling entire notebooks with intricate diagrams, strange sigils mixed with brewing formulas. Historians later note that the symbols resemble 15th century alchemical markings for transmutation. One page is titled "The Ninth Vessel" for blood and foam. When the workers clean the tower one morning, they find Walter's shoes neatly placed at the window's edge. No body, just the echo of dripping condensation and a single line scratched into the wood. He says the brew must never stop. The family hushes it up, of course. Official reports say he left Ireland for health reasons. But rumors swirl around Dublin. Locals claim that during every full moon, if you stand near the brewery gates, you can hear a voice humming softly, a tune that sounds eerily like the clinking of pint glasses. What if Walter wasn't mad? What if he really did hear something from beyond? After all, the fermentation room temperature never rises, even in summer. It's as if something or someone still keeps the yeast alive. You can almost smell the war smoke still lingering in Dublin's cold air. It's the 1940s now. Europe is rebuilding, industry's booming, and yet the Guinness family seems to be falling apart. One by one, like dominoes dipped in stout. It starts in 1944 when Brian Guinness, yes, the same Brian who once married the dazzling Diana Mitford, one of the infamous Mitford sisters, abandons the brewing empire for poetry and politics. His wife leaves him for Oswald Mosley, the British fascist leader. Society whispers, the Guinness charm is fading, but others mutter something darker. It's the curse. Then, tragedy multiplies faster than yeast in fermentation. In 1947, Henry Guinness drowns in his own swimming pool after a fainting spell. In 1951, a young relative crashes his car into a tree in Surrey, the steering column mysteriously locked. By 1956, Lady Henrietta Guinness throws herself from a bridge in Umbria, leaving behind a note that simply reads, "He wouldn't stop calling my name." You hear about it everywhere. Pubs, parliaments, pulp magazines. The Guinness curse returns, screams the tabloids. Even the Vatican reportedly receives a letter from an anonymous priest in Dublin claiming the family's pact has reached its third cycle. But what pact? And who's counting cycles? Some historians point to the family's eerie tendency to die young, wealthy, and inexplicably, despite generations of privilege. Others suggest something stranger, that every 90 years, the bloodline must ferment anew, that each tragedy is not random, but a kind of ritual reset. And if you think that's absurd, here's a fun fact. During this same decade, the brewery's quality control team begins testing experimental yeast strains that, for unknown reasons, never spoil. No matter the temperature, no matter the container, they stay alive. Coincidence? Maybe. But the locals of Dublin had another theory. They said the yeast was fed by something not entirely chemical. That somewhere in the cellars of St. James's Gate, the air itself carries whispers. One old brewer, before retiring, supposedly said this: "The beer's never gone bad because the dead don't rest." And you, standing here, listening to the story unfold, begin to realize that maybe, just maybe, immortality doesn't come from the beer you drink, but from the lives it takes. You descend into the cellar beneath St. James's Gate, the air thick with the scent of barley, dust, and something metallic. The story goes that during renovations in 1978, workers found a sealed compartment behind a crumbling brick wall. Inside, an old oak chest wrapped in oilcloth, stamped with the initials AG. When the foreman pried it open, the smell of iron filled the air. Not rust, blood. Inside lay a leather-bound ledger, darkened with age, its pages stiff and brittle. The ink, a deep glistening red. It wasn't ordinary ink. They later discovered it contained traces of hemoglobin. Yes, blood ink. At first, the Guinness archivists assumed it was some sort of ingredient record, a brewer's log. But the entries were strange. Dates lined up not with brewing batches, but with funerals. Next to each date, a Latin phrase was scrawled: ad perpetuum fermentationem, eternal fermentation. And then, beside every name, a small symbol, a drop, a crescent, or an open eye, carefully drawn. You flip the brittle pages. 1803, 1871, 1947, the same years that family members had mysteriously died, and after each death, a note, batch renewed, yeast remains pure. One passage catches your breath. When the moon turns full upon the gate, blood and grain must mingle anew, or the taste of rot will rise again. Scholars and conspiracy theorists go wild. Was Arthur Guinness part of some secret alchemical order? Did the family believe their beer and their fortune were tied to literal lifeblood? A modern chemist examines residue from the ledger's cover. Traces of yeast DNA are found, but not any known brewing strain. Its structure looks almost human. Now imagine that for a second. Every pint of Guinness carrying a whisper of bloodline passed down generation by generation through fermentation and ritual. When the story leaks to the press, Guinness HQ denies everything, calling it an elaborate hoax. The ledger disappears into company archives, never seen again. But rumor has it a photo of one page still circulates in Dublin's underground pubs, traded for shots of whiskey and secrets. If you ever find one, they say, you'll notice the last entry was left unfinished. A blank space after a single line, the next vessel awaits. The heir must bleed. And suddenly, you're not sure anymore if you're still talking about beer or something alive. You lean closer to the screen as the camera pans across an old lecture hall in Trinity College, Dublin. Dust dances lazily in the sunlight, and at the center stands Dr. Eamon Kelleher, a historian with a reputation for madness or genius. He clears his throat, taps the microphone, and says something that freezes the entire room. What if the Guinness curse was never a curse at all? You hear a few students snicker, but Kelleher continues, eyes gleaming. He projects an image, the same red leather ledger found beneath St. James's Gate. Each page filled with strange equations, not prayers. Each date matched not to deaths, but to births. He claims the Guinness family wasn't haunted, they were experimenting. Not on beer, on themselves. Imagine this, 1759, Arthur Guinness signs his legendary 9,000-year lease. But Kelleher argues it wasn't about immortality in business, it was immortality in biology. The ink formula in Arthur's signature? Laced with traces of iron oxide and something else. A proto-fermentation agent that appears centuries ahead of its time, one that could, theoretically, preserve organic matter indefinitely. Kelleher's theory grows darker. Every ritual in the Red Ledger might have been a genetic experiment disguised as a family tradition, a way to track traits, reactions, mutations. The deaths, he says, weren't coincidences, they were variables. Your breath slows. You picture the grand Guinness estate as less of a mansion and more of a laboratory. Did Arthur's descendants unknowingly continue a centuries-long experiment? Did every toast, every pint serve not to celebrate, but to record? The historian leans in, whispering now almost reverently, the true genius of Arthur Guinness wasn't brewing beer, it was brewing life. A student nervously raises their hand. But if it was an experiment, what was the goal? Kelleher smiles, the kind of smile that knows more than it should. That, he says, is what the next ledger entry might reveal. And as the lights flicker above him, you swear, just for a second, the shadow on the wall behind Dr. Kelleher looks like a man lifting a pint, smiling back. You scroll past another glossy corporate video, clean labs, smiling scientists, a voiceover saying Guinness Biotech, brewing the future of life. At first, it looks like any modern rebrand, the old beer empire reinventing itself for the 21st century. But something about that tagline, brewing the future of life, feels too literal. Dig deeper, and you find the names. The descendants of Arthur Guinness no longer run breweries, they run research divisions. Their facilities? Built suspiciously close to the old Dublin cellars. You recognize the logo, an elegant harp, but this time it's entwined with a DNA helix. Welcome to Guinness Laboratories, where the art of fermentation has evolved into the science of regeneration. They call it Project Phoenix. Publicly, it's about cellular rejuvenation and longevity research. Privately, well, the files leaked in 2017 tell a different story. Hidden in folders labeled Legacy Strain, scientists mention something called AG serum. AG, as in Arthur Guinness. You imagine a sterile white lab where bubbling tanks replace brewing vats, where yeast cultures have been replaced by something alive. The researchers talk about biofermenting human cells, reprogramming DNA through a process eerily similar to how Arthur once perfected his beer's dark foam. A corporate spokesperson once joked, "Guinness has always been about life. Now we just took it literally." No one laughed. But here's the twist. Internal memos reveal their experiments weren't funded by venture capital. They were funded by a family trust established in 1759, the same year Arthur signed the 9,000-year lease. The same handwriting appears on both documents, and if you pause the leaked footage just right, you'll see something disturbing. In one of the vats labeled AGPHX9, a faint silhouette moves. Not mechanically, organically. One scientist, speaking off record, said, "We're not cloning, we're restoring. He never left, he's just brewing." You close your laptop, heart pounding. The last frame shows a timestamp, 9,000 hours since Project Phoenix began. That's 375 days, exactly 1 year, and next week marks its anniversary. Whatever they've been brewing down there might finally be ready to be served. You're standing in front of a crumbling Georgian mansion outside Dublin. The air smells faintly of barley and old wood, like the ghosts of pints poured centuries ago. The place once belonged to Sebastian Guinness, the last known descendant of Arthur's bloodline. Sebastian wasn't your typical billionaire heir. No lavish parties, no yacht. Instead, he spent his nights in a private lab built inside the old brewery cellars, the same tunnels where Arthur himself was rumored to have met his mysterious partner. According to neighbors, they often heard low humming noises under the ground. Some swore it wasn't machines, it was chanting. A week before his disappearance, Sebastian posted a cryptic message on social media. "It ends tonight. The curse dies with me." Then, nothing. His mansion was found locked from the inside. Security cameras showed him descending into the cellar, carrying a silver chalice and a vial of deep crimson liquid. His own blood, police assumed. When investigators finally forced open the door, they found the lab in perfect order, except for one thing. On the table sat an empty pint glass engraved with the Guinness harp symbol, and beside it, a single note written in shaky ink. The deal was never about beer. It was about continuity. DNA traces suggested someone, or something, had been there with him. The temperature inside the cellar was recorded at 4 degrees Celsius, exactly the same as the optimal temperature for storing Guinness stout. The tabloids called it suicide. Conspiracy theorists claimed he'd been taken by the curse itself. But the most disturbing theory came from a scientist who reviewed Sebastian's private research. He was working on cellular regeneration using yeast DNA, attempting to mix human cells with the very organism that ferments Guinness. You can almost see it now, the bubbling vats, the faint glow of bioluminescent yeast under the microscope, and the echo of Arthur's voice whispering through the froth. Perfection never dies, it only brews again. And maybe that's exactly what Sebastian became. You're there, standing under the flickering light of the Guinness storehouse archives. The air feels colder than it should. In front of you sits a barrel sealed in 1759, untouched, its wood blackened with time and varnished with legend. The tag reads simply, Batch 0. It was found behind a false wall during the renovation of the old brewery, exactly 1 week after Sebastian Guinness's disappearance. Coincidence? Hardly. You watch as historians and scientists gather around it, their faces lit like children on Christmas morning. Only this gift smells faintly of iron and regret. When the barrel is finally opened, the room fills with a metallic tang, not the smell of beer, but something heavier. Inside lies a thick, dark liquid that refuses to foam. The chemists test it. No hops, no barley, no yeast. Instead, traces of hemoglobin. Blood. Floating atop it is a wax-sealed letter addressed to my successors. The signature, Arthur Guinness. The paper, impossibly preserved, reads in an elegant, looping hand. To brew perfection, one must sacrifice life. I merely offered what I had most, my bloodline. Each heir adds a drop to the vat. Each generation renews the pact. The flavor deepens, the legacy endures. If you're reading this, then one among you has tried to end the brewing. Tell him it cannot be stopped. The letter ends with a drawing, the same harp emblem, but inverted, and beneath it, a single Latin phrase. Sanguis est fermentum aeternitatis. Blood is the yeast of eternity. The scientists exchange nervous laughter, calling it a brilliant hoax. But you notice the youngest assistant quietly pocket a dropper sample, whispering, "For research." That night, Dublin's river turns slightly darker, the water shimmering faintly under the moonlight. Locals say it looked like someone poured stout straight into the Liffey. You can almost hear Arthur's voice echo through the city. The brew lives as long as you believe in it. And maybe, belief is exactly what keeps the curse alive. You're back where it all began, Dublin. The city hums softly under a blanket of mist, like it's exhaling secrets it has held for centuries. You step into the old Guinness estate, now silent, the air thick with malt and memory. The restoration team has left for the night. Only you remain, holding that ancient letter from Arthur and a single glass bottle filled with the dark liquid they called Batch Zero. The label is smeared, but you can still make out three faint words: drink, remember, continue. You shouldn't, you know that. But curiosity is a thirst no one ever truly quenches, so you pour it. The liquid gleams, thicker than beer, blacker than ink. You raise the glass. For a moment, you swear the reflection in it isn't yours. The taste burns cold, the world flickers. Suddenly, you're not in the room anymore. You're in 1759. You see Arthur Guinness himself, sitting in that candlelit study, signing the 9,000-year lease. His quill trembles. The ink isn't ink, it's blood. He looks up, and though he shouldn't see you, he smiles. "Took you long enough," he whispers. Behind him, the walls are covered in names. Every Guinness heir, every death, every toast. The ink pulses faintly like veins. You realize, each time one heir dies, another awakens. The curse wasn't punishment, it was preservation. Arthur raises his glass towards you. The brew must live, one soul for one pint. You blink, you're back in the present. The bottle is empty. Your reflection stares back at you again, except your eyes gleam the same faint gold seen in the portraits of every Guinness before you. The faintest echo hums through the room, low and melodic, like the first pour of a pint. To eternity and beyond the froth. You look down at your hands. They're trembling, or maybe vibrating, like something ancient just woke up inside. Somewhere in the distance, a factory whistle blows. The brewing starts again. The curse or the legacy continues. So, you made it. You followed the foam down the rabbit hole, from secret cellars in Dublin to forgotten breweries in Bruges, from dusty journals to blood-stained ledgers. And now you're standing where it all began, with one man, one dream, and one cursed pint. But here's the twist. Maybe it was never really a curse. Maybe it was a reminder that creation always demands a piece of its creator. Every masterpiece asks for sacrifice. Every pint tells the story of the hands that brewed it. Arthur Guinness didn't sell his soul for fame. He brewed it into the beer. Every frothy pour, every bitter finish, every clink of glass was a heartbeat echoing through time. And now, as you lift your own glass, metaphorical or otherwise, you realize the same truth applies to you. We all leave something behind in the things we make. A touch of madness, a trace of love, a drop of soul. So here's your toast to the creators, to the cursed, to those who pour themselves into what they love and keep pouring even when the glass runs dry. Because somewhere, Centuries from now, someone might take a sip of your creation and feel that same familiar burn of curiosity. And maybe, just maybe, they'll whisper back through time, "Took you long enough." The music fades, the glass empties, but the story, like the Guinness, never truly ends.